With the end of the Shadowbringers expansion drawing near and the release of Endwalker looming on the horizon, Final Fantasy XIV will be entering a new era of the game's life. While that may sound extremely obvious, as that is what an expansion is regardless of the game, Endwalker will likely go down as one of the most important expansions and major FF14 releases since A Realm Reborn back in 2013. For what seems to be the majority of the current player base, including myself, it'll be the first Final Fantasy XIV expansion they'll be around for in their time playing the game. And as new players continue to flood into the game at the tremendous rate they are currently, this number only continues to grow. With the sheer volume of new players, the expansion was guaranteed to be a big deal, as it will be the test to see how many players will remain and how many will leave during a large release on a scale that only a new expansion can provide. But Endwalker is so much more important to both what is the soon-to-be present FF14 and the future Final Fantasy XIV. Far more so than any expansion since ARR. Now, to some, that might not make any sense, so let me elaborate. As most will know, Endwalker will bring a close to the Hydaelyn vs Zodiark arc that began back with the launch of ARR in 2013, and has comprised every single expansion since then. With the game's main story, which is in many ways the driving force behind 14, following one path towards the conclusion that we will be getting in Endwalker. Since its relaunch, Final Fantasy XIV has had its direction thanks to the story and where it has guided the players' journeys over the past 8 years. But with that story coming to an end with the 6.0 patch and putting a close to that entire decade-long era of the game, we are entering a brand new era of the game, and us players have no idea what to expect. And in a lot of ways, that is what makes a video like this so exciting to make for me. With the story of the Hydaelyn vs Zodiark arc coming to an end, the game is free to go anywhere and not have to worry about continuing the plot, as it will be establishing a brand new one. The extra creative freedom that is on the horizon is remarkable, and this is a point in time for players to dream more and dream bigger than ever before about what is to come. However, when we don't know what to expect, we don't know what to expect or have any idea of what lies ahead outside a few possible hints that people have picked up on. So today I want to go over my hopes and fears for the future of Final Fantasy XIV and talk candidly about what I personally want for the game and its future direction, and what I want it to avoid. Of course, this is the definition of a selfish video to make, and chances are there's going to be a good few people that see this and disagree with literally everything I have to say. But this is just my opinion revolving around a game I have no influence over whatsoever, and chances are a game that those people who don't agree with me have no influence over whatsoever. So if you disagree with anything I say or have any hopes and fears related to mine, let me know in the comments, as I am very interested in to see what people have to say. I'll be going over 3 different aspects of the game, as well as my hope for revamps in the different video chapters, so if you want to know my thoughts on a specific topic, feel free to click ahead. But without further ado, let's get into it. First up is the story of Final Fantasy XIV, a part of the game that ignited my love for not only the game itself, but for making FF14 content, and is, in my opinion, one of the most important things going forward, and also the biggest threat to the game's future at the same time. It is well known and is no secret that a large number of people who play Final Fantasy XIV play only for the story each update before unsubbing until the next update, plot watchers if you will. Of course, commanding such numbers, it is important to keep them happy by providing them with great story content patch per patch. And honestly, who even outside of this group is opposed to having a great story within the game? Yet, despite their numbers, they are not the core of the player base whose patronage the game relies upon to, well, survive. It's not a bad thing to be a story-only player, but a video like this isn't really geared towards players like that, just a heads up. The core players that keep the game going are players that play the game regularly and experience a large variety of content within the game. The typical MMO player, whether you were a casual player just messing around and having fun, or a hardcore player with perfect pink logs who hasn't left T since you unlocked it. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you lie somewhere on the typical MMO player spectrum, as you not only click on a video like this, but are willing to invest time in Final Fantasy XIV related things that are not in the game. And the typical MMO player enjoys the freedom to do whatever they want within the game, a freedom that is only truly granted upon reaching max level and entering the endgame. So, what does that have to do with the story, you ask? Well, the endgame of an MMO is greatly impacted by the other players around you. That's the second M in MMO after all. Only problem is, no matter how good an MMO is, it is always losing players due to factors within the real world that no company could ever hope to control. And that constant leak of players is why it is so important for an MMO to always be gaining new players and have them reach endgame in order to keep things interesting for endgame players so they don't unsubscribe and can keep their sub numbers up. And to that, the story, which is the leveling process to Final Fantasy XIV, is the barrier of entry to reach the endgame. I'll say it again, so it can't be confused, I absolutely adore the story and leveling process of Final Fantasy XIV. However, thanks to its story, FF14 has the highest barrier to entry out of any of the top MMOs on the market, thanks to the fact that it effectively requires you to play through not 1, not 2, but 4 JRPGs and soon to be 5 to reach endgame, and unlock the MMO within the game. To take a look at roughly how many hours that is, let's give each expansion in the game a very conservative playthrough time of 40 hours. That is, the actual expansion and its patches. That is a 160 hour journey to endgame on the low end, with another 40 hours about to be dumped on top of it with Endwalker, and that might be the longest expansion to date thanks to, the fact it's wrapping everything up. 160 hours to reach endgame in today's day and age is absolutely ridiculous. And continuing to raise that barrier of entry expansion after expansion is just not sustainable for getting new players into the game, because when it reaches 300 hours in a couple years to get from 0 to endgame, no one's going to want to slog through that. I'm not advocating for boosts or story skips, which are things I actively oppose, or to remove the barrier of entry or trivialize it as seen with games like World of Warcraft, where you can go from 0 to max level easily in under 20 hours. Instead, with the story of Hydaelyn and Zodiark coming to an end, 14 has a golden opportunity to reset its barrier to entry in the near future and make it so far more players will reach the endgame and leave the free trial behind through some new systems and plot beats. Off the top of my head, I think to simply end the Hydaelyn and Zodiark arc with an event that makes everyone forget the Warrior of Light like how they did after the Calamity, freeing the canon Warrior of Light from their duties and allowing them the option of becoming a normal adventurer, only to feed them into the next story arc and build their renown from the ground up once more. This path of being forgotten would be for established players who beat A Realm Reborn all the way up through Endwalker. As for new players, give them the choice to level through the traditional 200-hour story of the Hydaelyn and Zodiark arc, or give them a new roughly 40-hour route that will quickly carry them through all the zones and let them unlock all the content through a new story that could be something like following in the Warrior of Light's path, before dumping them into the new story arc along with the already established players. If I was in control of the game, this is what I would do, using the 6.x patches to bridge the gap between the end of Hydaelyn vs Zodiark and the beginning of whatever is next, letting that kick off in full swing in 7.0. Almost like another rebirth to the game, but to a far lesser extent than ARR was. This would still give the players the option of leveling through the longer storyline of Hydaelyn vs Zodiark, or a much shorter original story, both leading the players to the same place to start the next story arc on equal footing, regardless of how long they've played the game. And I think making the Warrior of Light once again become forgotten would not only be a good and convenient move systematically, but could also easily be made to fit the already existing story and lore of 14, similar to how it was used in the beginning of 2.x. It would make sense for old players and greatly reduce the barrier of entry for new players without trivializing it. As 40 hours is around the traditional length of a Final Fantasy game, and is far longer to reach endgame than, well, most MMORPGs on the market, and that would be before you have to play through the new story arc. As for my specific hopes for the story, I personally am up for pretty much anything, and I trust that all of the upcoming story content in the future years will be just as amazing, if not better, than what has been present in Shadowbringers, thanks to the unbelievably talented Natsuko Ishikawa at the wheel of the narrative. Though if I am to share stories I personally wish to be explored, I'd love to return to the first, either 1,000 years after the events of the Eden Raids or just before the Flood. I'd love to have a few expansions based around the Algan Empire at different times in its lifespan. I'd love to visit multiple other shards to see what those worlds are like. I'd love to go back before the final days and see what Ascian society was like in its heyday leading up to its doom. I'd love to go to the New World and explore the cultures and storylines that have been hinted at there. But first and foremost, I think I'd simply like a storyline based around uncovering the secrets that the Source still holds after Endwalker is complete. Kinda like Graha's line in the Endwalker trailer, and frankly, I really want to explore the rest of Oathard and Ilzabard and other continents still shrouded in mystery like Mericidia. After a story arc that was the length of 5 full JRPGs, I'd love to have a smaller story arc that just lasts an expansion or two, or single expansion stories to fully explore without a massive overarching threat. And to have a buffer until the next inevitable big bad comes in and brings upon another 10-year story. However, that is just a very personal hope of mine, as chances are we're going straight into another multi-X-Pack story, which I'm fine with, but worried that it will be quite jarring. As for what I realistically think will happen, and this is pure speculation with not knowing what will transpire in Endwalker and where the events of that story will lead, and this requires pretty much the ultimate happy ending to transpire at the end of Endwalker and the Warrior of Light not being forgotten or the Scions disbanded, and if the Crystal Tower does indeed allow us to travel through time and space, like it has been alluded to, I kind of expect that we will end up traveling to the timeline where the 8th Umbral Calamity took place in order to try and clean things up there and set it back on the right path. If at the end of Endwalker the world is fully saved with no other threats lurking, I don't see the Scions willing to forsake a timeline of people if they have the ability to help them. Especially since they are the people that helped Graha and made it so that a timeline without the 8th Umbral Calamity actually exists. This of course would create some major timeline fuckery to the point that it might start looking like the Zelda timeline, but I think it makes sense when looking at who the characters are and their values. Although, for all we know, Endwalker might end up with the whole world being reset as a consequence of killing Zodiark and possibly Hydaelyn, or who knows, maybe all the Scions will be murdered. We don't know yet. Let's move on to the zones. As of now, the zones are pretty solid, but they quickly are showing their age in terms of their size and density. While the zones have gradually been getting slightly bigger or simply using their space far more effectively over the past 2 expansions, going into a new era of the game is the perfect opportunity to do a major engine upgrade or a refresh to a level not seen since ARR. And while I do love the zones in 14, once you unlock flying, and especially once you get a riding map or two, they quickly find themselves feeling quite small and, well, video gamey. And thanks to always being interrupted by a loading screen between each zone, which you pass through quite quickly mid-air, the game often loses its sense of world, and the constant loading screens can be quite immersion breaking. It's a different story with teleporting, as being thrown into a black void when skipping from one side of the world to another or between worlds isn't that unexpected. While I do think that it won't be a major issue if they keep making 6 of the same size zones each expansion, as long as they are incredible and use their spaces very well, with gaming on a wider scale moving more towards large open areas, or at the very least heavily cutting down on loading screens, including rival MMOs that are already running and those on the horizon, I feel like Final Fantasy XIV is somewhat falling behind, and that it should move more towards these larger living and breathing areas that are basically the size of multiple zones and feel like actual vast worlds to get lost in rather than simple video game levels. I know there's an argument to be made with the sheer variety of different areas that FF14 tries to show in an expansion, with Endwalker looking to be pretty much on crack with a floating island, a brutal tundra, a seemingly underground world, and the fucking moon, all coming with the next expansion, and that variety being worth not having these larger areas. And then there is the fact of how much more demanding it would be both client and server side, and that being a major undertaking to work on. Well, that's understandable, but to be fair, the servers, especially NA, have been on fire for the last few weeks and strained for the last few months. And the way the game is built on a base level has been shown to be getting in the way of the devs' ambitions way more than it should be lately. As I said, I think they should replace all the base in the upcoming years and truly modernize it so they can do whatever they want. Would that be an absolutely huge undertaking? Yes, it would 100% be, but it would be better for the future of the game. But to relate it back to the zones, this kind of modernization would be a game changer and could allow for far more things within the game's overworld that truly make it worth exploring and spending long periods of time in, even after hitting cap and finishing the MSQ. Just imagine with me for a second, and we'll use familiar territory to do so. Picture in your mind a brand new expansion where, say, we get to go to the first 1,000 years after the flood, with life having dramatically increased in the region and the world thriving. Instead of 6 new smaller zones, we get one absolutely gigantic one with many different leveled areas within it, and many secrets hidden above and far below its surface, where you're able to walk out from the wilds into the Crystarium with no loading screen, and you can traverse from the southernmost point of Amarang to the northernmost point of Ilmeg freely, and it takes 20 minutes to get between them while flying. Quests and towns would be galore, overworld dungeons, and more overworld bosses in addition to the instance ones. A whole expansion and patch cycle taking place in this living, breathing world full of content and only adds upon what we would normally have in an X-Pack, cutting nothing, and an MSQ just as long as a normal expansion taking us all across this world. If you look at the MMOs on the horizon, this kind of world is what they pride themselves on. The sense of world and joy of exploration that the genre slowly lost and games as a whole moved away from for a time. It would be Final Fantasy XIV as we know and love, but with more things to do, achieve, and collect. I personally wish going out and staying out in the world was actually worth doing in 14 with things to accomplish. And I'm personally tired of just standing in a main city or a housing district waiting for a queue to pop to enter another instance and that being the entirety of the endgame. 14 is such a great sense of world until you finish the MSQ where it just stops. And wanting this overworld aspect of an MMO is the only reason I have any interest in upcoming games like Ashes of Creations and New World. The latter of which I doubt will have any staying power, and its progression will likely be killed by its publisher within a few months. Would a lot of people hate this in 14? I don't know why, but probably some would. Would it require a larger budget and team? Yes, but those two things are owed and are long since overdue to be given to the 14 dev team, who have shown just how incredible they are time and time again. I personally believe this is the best direction for the game's zones, and I don't see a world where this does anything but add to the game's appeal. Next, let's talk about battle content, the bulk of the content in most MMOs. As it stands now, Final Fantasy XIV has all of the battle content that you'd expect from an MMO in its raids, trials, and dungeons, and extra battle content that comes by expansion in terms of Eureka and Bozja. I love the raids and the trials, which all have multiple different difficulties to tackle, and then Bozja is by far my favorite content to run regularly in the entire game. Notice how I excluded dungeons? Yeah. Well, the dungeons in this game are decent overall and have been better since recovering from Stormblood Syndrome, which is what I call the literal hallway sims dungeons in that expansion. They are easy as hell, and even their hard modes are an absolute joke. Something I really want in the future of the game is for them to release extreme modes of each dungeon with a few extra boss mechanics and just generally a huge increase in difficulty. I do like the dungeons, but I constantly find myself craving more of a challenge when running them, and I really want to have more difficult 4-man content that isn't running deep dungeons, which I think are a lot closer to a multiplayer roguelike than a traditional MMORPG dungeon. I wouldn't expect good gear to drop from these, but I think that you could easily move the minion orchestration rolls or maybe even some kind of other collection item like a mount that you would acquire by completing extreme dungeons. I think this would also be a great way to have hard content that you could easily work away at with a small group of friends, as the dynamic of a group doing difficult content with 4 players is very different from a group with 8. I highly doubt anyone would be against this, and I think that is something the devs could pretty easily implement, especially if they were to release an extreme dungeon a patch behind, as in that point they could just stretch one patch's content to 2 with only some tweaks. As for the other battle content, well, I personally believe the 3 Savage raid tiers across the expansion is sufficient, as that is 12 bosses total and they are all mechanic heavy and takes the bulk of the Savage or above raiders, which are already the tiny minority of overall players, a while to prog through. The 24-man Alliance raids are meant to be more casual content, so I think they should just leave those alone, and while I only dream of someday running Ultimates myself, I do think that 2 per expansion based on fights from previous expansions is the best to keep that kind of content cycle consistent. But once again, I don't do this content, so I'm just an outsider looking in with that thought. So if you think I'm wrong in that, just simply discard my opinion, honestly. As for things like Bozja, I definitely want more things like that from here on out. While you can take Bozja at your own pace, and that is definitely encouraged, it isn't what you would call casual content. If there's 72 players in an instant, chances are the maximum 3 of them are just story-only players wanting to give something new a try, with the vast majority being players that are far more committed to the game. I'd basically like to see a bigger and better version of Bozja with more raids and unique and desired things to acquire. That way the players reason to devote more time to it and it will not die out as quickly between updates and hopefully won't be near abandoned by the next expansion. Poor Eureka. Related to battle content is the weekly and daily content in 14, which isn't something that you need to upkeep to keep up with everyone else, but is maintained by most to have something to do and to optimize. Honestly, I think weeklies and even dailies are pretty much perfect in 14 right now. There's a good amount of it, but not too much it's intrusive, and there's a wide variety of things from squadrons to tombstone capping to wondrous tales to custom deliveries to beast tribes and everything else. With even more variety coming in Endwalker and beyond, no doubt, including the new feature I am most looking forward to in 6.0, the Island Sanctuary. I may not seem the type, but I used to be addicted to games like Stardew Valley and Animal Crossing. Okay, I got a bit off topic there, let's move on to the final topic, Revamps. Revamps are common in MMOs as they change up the old content to recycle it and give players something new to do, or to just straight up improve on things that maybe weren't so great in the first place. If it wasn't for the fact that on a technical level 2.0 and beyond is a completely different game from 1.0, you could say that the current Final Fantasy XIV is a giant revamp of the original. Aside from basic housekeeping, I don't think 14 really needs to revamp all that much. And frankly, the only thing it needs to do is finally remove all traces of PS3 limitations or architecture that still remains in the game. Something that has been clearly worked on since the end of Heavensward, and especially with the game now being played on PS5. So for Shadowbringers and Stormblood content, I don't see a need to revamp anything, as that content is still relevant to certain crowds and you can recruit members in PF for just about anything in those expansions. Though I would like to see Square add something more to Bozja with the launch of 6.0 to hopefully avoid the content becoming near abandoned and requiring the use of Discord servers to be able to partake in. Because as it stands now, aside from the relic weapons which can be easily farmed outside of Bozja and Zadnor, and leveling classes from 71 to 80 which may very well be deemed irrelevant in the future, I don't see any future for the content, and it would be a shame to see it reduced from its current relevance and left to memory as has basically happened to Eureka. And I think some sort of new incentive to go back and take on Eureka would be great, or really just anything to boost its numbers in some way. Now then, we move on to Heavensward and A Realm Reborn content. Oh boy. While Heavensward is to a lesser extent, both of these expansions scream PS3 limitations. I would personally love for the devs to go back and bring these areas up to modern standards in small ways for Heavensward and bigger ones for A Realm Reborn. ARR is the worst looking part of the game, and Heavensward isn't much better, and that dated look isn't great. Especially when pulling new players through those areas for 100 hours is a requirement to advance. I think visually these areas would greatly benefit from some new updated textures and environment models just to make it look a little nicer. On top of that, I would love to see Ul'dah, Limsa, Minsa, Gridania, and Ishgard to all have their loading screens removed and just reunite the two zones within the city with maybe a new area or two bridging the gap. Ul'dah might end up being a little confusing, but half the city is already a maze. Gridania would be super easy to navigate since the two areas could slot together pretty much perfectly, Ishgard might take a little more work or new areas to bridge the gap between Foundation and Pillars, and the only one that I think might be worrisome is Limsla Minsa, which, when you go back and see how it was in 1.0, yikes, it was a mess. All of this is just small nitpicky things that don't really matter, but I think would be nice is all of the new cities since PS3 support was dropped have been the same size as the loading divided ones, but without that loading divide. On top of that, while the Heavensward zones are fine, I would love to see a full revamp of the ARR zones, either by simply combining them or both combining them and filling in the gaps with new terrain. I think that this would be a great way to not only make the much smaller ARR zones more immersive, impressive, and awe-inspiring to new players, but also a great way to test a larger, more diverse, and open zone design. They are the perfect zones to do this for so many reasons. They are what most people would be most familiar with. It would be extremely easy to see the improvements. The zone themes are far more versatile and would suit long-winded adventuring far better than other zone themes. They are far more important to the overall story of the game, etc, etc. That's really all of the major revamps I can think of without going far past the point of nitpicking, which arguably I'm already doing. So those are some of my hopes and fears for the future of Final Fantasy XIV. At least a more concise version, as I could go on for hours and end up running in circles, no doubt. Though, now that you've been listening to me talk for God knows how long, I'm curious what other people think about what I had to say, and what their hopes and fears for the future are. So if you feel like sharing, please leave a comment, as I am very excited to read through them. I've only been playing 14 for about 15 months now, and it's been my first MMO experience, and I hope to be playing it and for the game to keep getting better and better for years upon years to come, and seeing more and more people recently coming into the game and experiencing what I have is absolutely fantastic to see. And while the game is in an era of prosperity and growth like never before, I think it is always important to see how things could improve in the future and hope the game doesn't lose sight of its, well, future, or become too arrogant with its new status among MMOs. I personally don't think that will happen as long as Yoshi P is in charge, but at the end of the day, the game is simply a product for a company to make money on, and after seeing the path other games have gone down, it's never unwarranted to be at least somewhat skeptical. But I'm going to call the video there, as apparently the script is already at 5,000 words. Damn. So if you liked the video, please make sure to like it and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. It really does help out a lot. And also check out links below to help support the channel. And with that, as always, my name's Lokidum. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.